Under the grey dawn of April 18, 1942, the Pacific swelled with steel and salt. A cold wind blew over the deck of the USS Hornet as her sailors worked in tense silence. Engines hummed beneath the surface, a low growl of purpose. On the flight deck, 16 B-25 bombers, Army aircraft never meant for carriers, stood ready, their olive-drab skins gleaming faintly in the mist. Somewhere in that horizon lay Japan. It had been just 4 months since Pearl Harbor, and yet here were American carriers again, deep in enemy waters, far earlier than Tokyo had ever thought possible. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, April 1942, to Japan's High Command. This was unthinkable. After December 7th, their planners believed the U.S. Pacific Fleet would take at least 2 years to recover. Carriers were presumed crippled, bases shattered, morale broken. The Imperial General Staff had projected leisurely expansion, southward to the Dutch East Indies, westward to Burma, eastward into the Central Pacific. But now reconnaissance planes whispered of something else. American carrier task forces spotted near the Marshalls, near Wake, near the very heart of the Empire's defensive ring. Japanese Combined Fleet Operational Diary, March 1942. The sea had become a rumor mill of ghosts. Destroyers reported radar blips that vanished. Merchant convoys saw silhouettes that slipped into fog. Japanese captains dismissed them as phantoms, until the Doolittle Raiders struck Tokyo. 16 bombers, launched from a carrier thought hundreds of miles away, dropped their payloads and vanished into the clouds. It wasn't the physical damage that shook Japan, it was the impossible timing. How could the Americans be back so soon? Imperial Japanese Navy Air Staff Memo, April 1942. In Washington, the U.S. Navy's recovery had moved with manic intensity. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz reorganized the Pacific Fleet not around battleships, but around speed. Aircraft carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet became the new spearheads. The dry docks at Pearl Harbor glowed through the nights, welders turning wrecks into warships again. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships, together with hundreds of civilian engineers, accelerated refit programs from months to weeks. Damaged destroyers were stripped, repaired, and sent back into the blue. Bureau of Ships Engineering Report, February 1942. Even as the Japanese believed the Americans were licking their wounds, the U.S. was already deploying task forces. Enterprise and Yorktown struck the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in January. Lexington raided Rabaul in February. These were probing attacks, but they sent a message loud and clear. The Pacific Fleet was mobile again. The shockwaves in Tokyo were immediate. Intelligence officers argued over maps in disbelief. These coordinates didn't make sense. How could carriers, supposedly without bases, fuel, or escort, appear across thousands of miles of ocean? Combined Fleet Intelligence Summary, Feb 1942. The answer lay in a combination of improvisation and industry. The U.S. Navy had transformed its logistics almost overnight. Oilers and supply ships were converted from merchant hulls, forming a mobile replenishment fleet that shadowed carriers across the Pacific. Pilots trained relentlessly in deck landings and night navigation, while repair crews performed miracles on the fly. Pearl Harbor, once a graveyard of twisted metal, became a round-the-clock factory of resurrection. Every ship that could float was patched, armed, and sent back, one worker recalled. Naval Shipyard Honolulu Oral History Project, 1946. Meanwhile, Japan celebrated its string of victories. Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, but beneath that triumph lay arrogance. The Imperial Navy still saw carriers as extensions of battleship doctrine, not independent strike forces. Their logistics lines were stretched thin, their intelligence blinded by overconfidence. Admiral Yamamoto himself, the architect of Pearl Harbor, warned that Japan had only 6 months to win decisive victories before American industry would awaken. His prediction, recorded in a private letter, would prove hauntingly accurate. Yamamoto Correspondence, Jan 1942. By late March, U.S. Task Force 16 under Vice Admiral Halsey and Task Force 18 under Admiral Fletcher were already operating beyond expected limits. The Navy's cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo, had begun to intercept Japanese transmissions, giving American commanders near real-time insight into enemy movements. These signals were still incomplete, but they allowed Halsey to strike where least expected. The psychological shift was seismic. Japan was now reacting, not dictating. U.S. Naval Intelligence Bulletin, March 1942. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots flying reconnaissance over the Coral Sea and Solomon Islands began reporting strange things, carrier formations that disappeared between storms, radio chatter in new frequencies, aircraft with longer range. The Imperial Navy's signals intelligence could not keep up. "The enemy is moving faster than logistics allow," one frustrated officer wrote in his log. Dramatized composite. He didn't know it, but he was right. U.S. naval engineers, particularly those from General Electric and Westinghouse, had quietly installed upgraded radio and radar systems aboard American carriers, improving coordination, reducing time lost to confusion. Naval Research Lab Communications Report, 1942. The most astonishing development came not from the admirals, but from the engineers in San Diego and Norfolk. They had begun experimenting with modular repair systems, standardized replaceable components for flight decks, catapults, and arrestor cables. This meant that a carrier hit in one engagement could be restored in days rather than months. The result was a fleet that seemed invincible, always present, always returning. "Hit one and two more appear," a Japanese naval attaché lamented in a message to Berlin. German Naval Attaché Report, May 1942. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened emergency meetings. The air over the capital was still heavy with smoke from the Doolittle raid, and the mood was brittle. Intelligence Minister Major General Kawabe briefed the cabinet. American carriers had been sighted 650 miles east of Japan only days before the attack. It was impossible. Japanese analysts recalculated distances, fuel loads, and deck capacity, and yet the math refused to make sense. If this is true, Kawabe warned, it means their carriers move like land-based aircraft. Japanese Cabinet Meeting Minutes, April 1942. And so the myth of American paralysis died. What had seemed like a broken navy was now a ghost fleet, appearing, striking, vanishing. Japan's strategic map, once expanding with confidence, began to shrink under the weight of uncertainty. Every island now felt within reach of an enemy that shouldn't yet exist. And deep beneath the waves of the Pacific, submarines of the U.S. Navy prowled, feeding reconnaissance back to the carriers, tightening the noose of intelligence and movement. U.S. Submarine Command Report, April 1942. As dawn broke on that fateful day over Tokyo, smoke trails drifted above the Imperial Palace. The shock in the High Command was not from the bombs, but from the realization that America's carriers had survived, adapted, and struck back with impossible speed. Japan had believed it had time. Now that illusion was gone. The Empire's clock was ticking faster than anyone in Tokyo could bear to admit, and far across the Pacific, inside a cramped communications room aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Halsey looked over a coded dispatch and gave a quiet order. "Tell them this is just the beginning." Task Force 16 log, April 1942. In the weeks following the Doolittle raid, the Japanese High Command entered a state of restless disbelief. How had the Americans managed such precision, such audacity, and such speed? The Imperial Navy's analysts scoured intercepted radio chatter, naval logs, and aerial reconnaissance reports, but the data pointed to an uncomfortable truth. The United States had achieved a kind of mobility Japan's rigid command structure could not comprehend. Imperial Navy Intelligence Division Report, May 1942. What Japan didn't know was that the secret lay not in the admirals, but in the machines beneath them. American aircraft carriers, the new capital ships of a reborn navy, were evolving faster than Japan's could counter. The key was engineering, an entire industrial symphony of innovation conducted across factories from Norfolk to San Diego. Engineers at the Bureau of Ships, led by Rear Admiral Samuel M. Robinson, developed faster lift systems, deck-edge elevators, and modular repair techniques that cut recovery times in half. Bureau of Ships Technical Circular No. 22, 1942, but speed required coordination. The Americans had something else, FM radio communications, a revolution in naval warfare, where Japan's carriers still relied on unreliable long-wave AM sets that crackled and faded under atmospheric interference. The U.S. Navy had adopted short-range, high-fidelity FM radios built by Motorola and RCA. They allowed pilots, escorts, and flagships to coordinate in real time. It was the invisible thread that made American fleets move as one organism. Naval Communications Laboratory Report, March 1942. Japanese pilots who intercepted early American task forces were stunned at their precision. "The enemy changes formation faster than our messages reach command," one flyer wrote after the Marshall's raid. Dramatized composite. What he witnessed was a product of the U.S. Navy's combat information centers, rooms deep inside each carrier that used radar plots and voice communication to manage battles dynamically. Developed by engineers like Lieutenant Commander Robert C. Calhoun, the CICs turned chaos into clarity. Office of Naval Research Development Memo 1942. Radar itself was the next hidden blade. While Japanese carriers had none, the U.S. Navy had installed the CXAM-1 air search radar across its major ships, capable of detecting aircraft at over 80 miles and ships at 20. Operators learned to interpret ghostly green echoes in the dark, granting American fleets an early warning advantage that could mean the difference between life and annihilation. Technical Manual TM-9-294, 1943. This combination of radar, FM communication, and logistics speed came to full expression in the Battle of the Coral Sea. May 1942, the world's first carrier versus carrier engagement. The battle would define how speed and coordination could rewrite the laws of naval combat. It began on May 4th, when Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher moved to intercept the Japanese Port Moresby invasion fleet. With him were the carriers Lexington and Yorktown. Japanese Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue's plan was elegant: use light carriers Shoho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku to cover transports, striking swiftly before the Americans could respond. But his intelligence was days old. The Americans, reading fragments of the Japanese Naval Code JN-25, already knew where and when to strike. U.S. Naval Intelligence Bulletin, May 1942. On May 7th, under heavy clouds and volatile winds, the two fleets launched waves of aircraft in opposite directions, searching, guessing, striking blind. The sea below was a chessboard, but only one side had radar. Fletcher's task force detected Japanese aircraft at 68 miles. Within minutes, Wildcats and Dauntlesses were airborne. On the Japanese side, confusion reigned. Their scouts found American oilers and escorts first, wasting precious torpedoes on decoys. Action Report, USS Yorktown, May 1942. When the Americans finally located Shoho, the result was devastating. 93 dive bombers and torpedo planes descended in coordinated fury. The carrier was hit by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes in minutes. "Scratch one flat top," Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon radioed back, a phrase that would echo through naval history. Task Force 17 radio log, May 7, 1942. Japan struck back the next day. Their air groups found Lexington and Yorktown and launched a full assault. The Lexington took 2 torpedoes and multiple bombs. Flames consumed her decks, fuel lines ruptured. Yet even in death, she proved America's resilience. Damage control teams fought for hours before the order came to abandon ship. Her crew was evacuated, her spirit transferred to the next generation of carriers already under construction in Newport News and Puget Sound. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. The true shock to Tokyo came not from the loss of Shoho, but from the aftermath. Within 3 weeks, Yorktown, badly damaged, was back at Pearl Harbor for repair. Japanese analysts estimated she would be out of action for months. Instead, American dock workers and Navy engineers repaired her in 72 hours. They patched her flight deck with steel plate, rewired her power grid, and sent her to Midway. Japan's naval attachés dismissed the reports as propaganda. They were wrong. Pearl Harbor Naval Yard Engineering Summary, May 1942. This was the secret: speed through industry. Behind every carrier was a web of thousands of men and women, Rosie the riveters, machinists, welders, engineers, turning the might of Detroit and Pittsburgh into seaworthy miracles. Each hull section was prefabricated, transported, and welded in record time. By June 1942, new Essex-class carriers were already emerging, larger, faster, and more heavily armed. War Production Board Manufacturing Report, June 1942. At Coral, Japan had technically won a tactical victory. They sank Lexington and damaged Yorktown. But strategically, the tide turned. For the first time, Japan's invasion plans were halted. Their carriers returned to Truk Lagoon bruised and exhausted, their aircrews depleted. "Our advantage in mobility no longer exists," read a confidential dispatch to Admiral Yamamoto. Combined Fleet Situation Report, May 1942. The U.S. had achieved what Japan thought impossible: sustained offensive tempo. Carriers no longer vanished into months of refit. They rotated seamlessly, supported by oilers, repair ships, and mobile supply units. At sea, the Americans had learned to refuel and rearm without returning to port. A logistical ballet choreographed by engineers at the Navy's Service Force Pacific. Logistics Division Memo, July 1942. Japanese pilots began reporting eerie phenomena. American task forces appearing far beyond calculated range. "It is as if they live at sea," wrote one ensign after the Battle of Santa Cruz, dramatized composite. He wasn't wrong. The American carrier fleet had become a self-sustaining organism. Radar eyes, radio nerves, steel muscles, while Japan's remained tethered to fixed bases and outdated doctrine. Naval Staff Technical Analysis, 1942, and the greatest proof of that speed was yet to come. Only 3 weeks after Coral Sea, Japan launched its grand offensive at Midway, believing the U.S. still crippled. They had no idea that Yorktown, resurrected from flames, was already en route. Her patched deck still smoked from hasty welding. Her crew had barely rested. But she was there. As the Japanese fleet steamed east toward Midway Atoll, confident in overwhelming power, Admiral Yamamoto's staff still asked one question: how? Could the Americans recover this fast? Japanese Naval Staff Log, May 1942. The answer, industrial speed, invisible communication, and human will, was about to change the Pacific forever. The morning of June 4, 1942, broke over the Midway Atoll with a thin band of light and an ocean as smooth as glass. The Japanese combined fleet moved in perfect formation. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Above them, planes began to launch in waves toward Midway's airfield. The operation was flawless, precise, and confident, but they were walking into a storm they could not see. Beneath the horizon, the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown waited silently, hidden by cloud cover and superior intelligence. This was the day that American speed, coordination, and innovation would turn the tide of the Pacific War. U.S. Navy After Action Report, June 1942. At 4:30 a.m., radar operators aboard Midway detected incoming aircraft, 97 Japanese planes inbound at 150 miles. The warning went out instantly. In Tokyo's war rooms, such early detection was still believed impossible. But the U.S. radar network made it real. Pilots scrambled, engines roared to life, and within minutes the Americans were airborne. This simple act, the ability to react within minutes rather than hours, was the culmination of radar, FM communications, and lightning repair infrastructure forged in the fire of Pearl Harbor. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943. The Japanese believed the Americans had only one operational carrier, Yorktown, and that it was still in dry dock. When reconnaissance planes spotted 3, confusion rippled through Admiral Nagumo's flagship Akagi. 3 carriers? Impossible, he muttered, staring at the scout report in disbelief. His staff scrambled to rearm their planes with anti-ship ordnance, a delay that would prove fatal. Combined Fleet Operational Log, June 1942. At 10:22 a.m., the American dive bombers found their mark. From 19,000 feet, dauntless aircraft plummeted toward Akagi and Kaga. Bombs sliced through clouds, detonating on decks laden with refueling planes and torpedoes. Within minutes, 2 of Japan's mightiest carriers were engulfed in flames. Smoke rose like a dark banner over the Pacific. Minutes later, Soryu was hit. In less than 5 minutes, 3 carriers were destroyed. Japanese sailors screamed, trapped in infernos of aviation fuel. The Empire's illusion of dominance died in those minutes. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The decisive moment of Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was a technological one. Every bomb dropped, every plane coordinated, every fleet movement executed with precision came from the web of speed and communication that Japan underestimated. The U.S. Navy's combat information centers turned chaos into pattern recognition, allowing commanders to react instantly. Japanese doctrine, still rigid and centralized, could not keep up. Naval Combat Information School Transcript, 1943. What followed was a transformation not just of warfare but of psychology. Across the Pacific, American crews realized something fundamental. The war was no longer about who had more ships, but who could move faster, think faster, rebuild faster. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, industrial and networked, where the brain of the fleet mattered as much as its guns. Office of Naval Analysis Report, 1944. Japan's high command in the aftermath struggled to understand how their superior pilots and ships could be so decisively outmaneuvered. They began interrogating survivors, seeking clues. "They know where we are before we know ourselves," said one pilot. Dramatized composite. "Their machines speak to each other faster than we can shout." That pilot unknowingly described the future of warfare, information as weapon. Japanese Air Arm Debrief, July 1942. As the war dragged on, the U.S. multiplied its advantage. The Essex-class carriers rolled off production lines in less than a year. Engineers at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company designed modular compartments for easier construction, while the Puget Sound Naval Yard developed interchangeable catapult systems. The Essex could carry 100 aircraft, cruise at 33 knots, and operate for months without dock support. Each was a floating city of steel and innovation. War Production Board Shipbuilding Report, 1944. Supporting them was a new kind of naval logistics, the Mobile Service Squadron. Oilers, ammunition ships, floating dry docks and hospital vessels formed the Service Force Pacific, allowing entire fleets to remain at sea indefinitely. The Japanese, still dependent on island bases, found themselves cornered by an enemy that never stopped moving. Admiral Raymond Spruance described it best: "Our fleet no longer sails home. The ocean itself is our base." Fleet Operations Memo, 1944. Psychologically, this transformation shattered Japan's confidence. Post-war interrogations revealed despair spreading through its officer corps after Midway. "We knew the Americans were not supermen," one staff officer recalled, "but we could not understand their machines." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Industrial resilience, the ability to rebuild Yorktown in 3 days, to launch replacement aircraft before battle damage reports even arrived, became the weapon Japan could never match. Even on the human level, this speed had profound consequences. American engineers and yard workers, many of them civilians, became unsung heroes. Women in welding masks, machinists in Detroit, and radio engineers in New Jersey were as crucial to victory as any admiral. "We fight here with torches and rivets," one worker wrote in a letter home, "and every ship we finish brings our boys home faster." Personal Correspondence Archive. 1943. By 1944, Japan's fleet was a ghost of its former self. Carriers like Taiho and Zuikaku launched into hopeless battles against American task forces that seemed to regenerate overnight. Radar-directed fighters swarmed the skies. FM-guided air coordination outpaced Japanese interceptors. Even Yamamoto's prophecy, 6 months of unchecked dominance, had proven eerily correct. America had turned 6 months of defeat into an era of relentless offense. Naval Historical Analysis, 1945. But the deeper story of the American carrier's speed was not just machines, it was adaptability. Engineers treated every failure as a prototype. After Lexington's loss, fuel line systems were redesigned to prevent flash fires. After Yorktown's damage, flight deck armor was increased. Every battle taught lessons, integrated within weeks. The fleet was learning, evolving, thinking, a living organism of steel and strategy. Navy Bureau of Ships Modification Report, 1943. By the time Japan realized this, it was too late. The same carriers that vanished after Pearl Harbor now struck daily across the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marianas to the Philippines. Each operation built upon the last, each raid faster, each repair shorter. America's fleet had become a storm system, sustained, self-correcting, unstoppable. Pacific Fleet Operations Record 1944. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, its admirals faced a humbling truth. The war was not lost merely at Midway or Guadalcanal, but in the invisible spaces between battles, in the factories, in the signal rooms, in the minds of engineers who turned chaos into speed. Post-war surveys confirmed it. Logistics and communication, not raw firepower, had determined the outcome. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Standing on the deck of the USS Enterprise in late 1945, now streaked with rust and glory, an anonymous officer wrote in his log, "We were never faster than our ships. We were faster than our fear." Dramatized composite. In the cold mathematics of history, Japan's high command was correct about one thing: time decides wars. They simply misjudged whose clock was ticking faster. In the modern age, satellite wars, digital networks, unmanned fleets, the lesson endures. The victors are not those who strike hardest, but those who strike again before the enemy even realizes the last blow has fallen. In 1942, the Empire of Japan learned this truth the hard way. The American carriers they thought destroyed had returned too soon, and they never stopped coming back.